Hello, friends. My name is Su. I'm a philosopher recognized by the Dutch government, and I lived in the Netherlands for already 7 years. I have been conducting independent research in the past 20 years, and about 10 years ago, I obtained a master's degree in continental philosophy from a British university. I was born in the late 1980s in China, and my parents were born in the early 1950s. So, both from my own experience and my parents' experience, I witnessed many things in China. And since I came to the West, I also witnessed many things in the West. It gives me a lot of unique insights that many scholars from the global South might share with me. The reason I decided to make this channel is that we live in a time that the world order has been changing so rapidly. And people, especially people from the global South, are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the dominating narratives monopolized by the Western media. About a few weeks ago, I was watching YouTube and I saw Michael Hudson. I saw some of his interviews, and it's super interesting because I read many of his works before, and they are very interesting and inspiring works. And I was thinking to myself, time is ripe. It is time for me to share some of my own research outcomes with the public, especially with audiences from the global South. Michael Hudson is known for his very harsh critiques of the new conservatives of America, the new liberalism, so to speak, and he connects it with the Chicago School of Economy. It tries to convince the students that this would be the only way it works for the economy, to let the whole country's wealth be owned by 1% of the population, the rentier class, the financial capitalists, and leave the rest of the population in debt. However, what I want to mention today is another Chicago school. Chicago School of Political Science is connected with the economic school, and they both give birth to the new conservatives of America. But the political school is particularly known for its Straussians that once served George W. Bush's administration. When I say Straussians, I mean the students who follow the teachings of Leo Strauss, who was once a professor of University of Chicago. He was originally a Jewish German who escaped from Nazi Germany in the 1940s to America. Leo Strauss is probably one of the best classicists in the 20th century. And he has very comprehensive and rich readings in the original texts from the ancient Greek, from the Arabic, from the Islamic world and the Jewish world. He's not particularly enthusiastic in politics. Even when he serves in the political science department of the Chicago University, he's actually quite against the term political science. He says something like, "Oh, since when political philosophy becomes a science? That's so horrible, because political philosophy is political philosophy. So it's not something that should be called a science." But he serves in the political science department anyway. And although he always proclaims that philosophy should distance itself from the politics in order to defend its own domain, his followers always bring his teachings into politics and serves the American politics, which is quite betraying Leo Strauss's original teaching, actually. But Leo Strauss does not only have his influences in America, but also in China. There's a professor, Professor Liu from the People's University of China, who actually organized translating almost all of Leo Strauss's work into Chinese. So I'm mentioning the university, the People's University of China, now because it's quite a coincidence that another professor, Professor Wen, who actually collaborated with Michael Hudson in the book The Destiny of Civilization, he also serves in the People's University of China. So somehow you see a sort of connection there. Professor Wen is one of the major speakers who share the Chinese experience of socialism with the rest of the world. His English book, 10 Crises, shows you very clearly how socialism with Chinese characteristics evolves from the early 1950s to the 21st century. I have mentioned so many names and many things today because they are all relevant to the topic I want to talk about. And I want to talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. So this is a term you often heard from China. But what is China's system? It's a system of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I want to say socialism with Chinese characteristics is actually a way of exoteric expression, or a way of exoteric writing, so to speak. And this is a terminology originally invented by Leo Strauss in his Persecution and Art of Writing. It's not really a book, it's just a paper because it's not very long, it's an article. And in this article, he distinguishes between what he calls esoteric writing and exoteric writing. And esoteric writing is a way of writing that is intended to be understood by the few, not by the majority, not by the public. And exoteric writing is a way of writing to be understood by both the public, the majority, and the few, but in completely different ways. So here's a funny thing. So if you are the public and if you belong to the few intellectuals, both of you would understand what this person is writing about, but with completely different meanings. Here's the funny part. I originally read about these distinctions from Leo Strauss about 20 years ago. Then I suddenly started to understand many things that would otherwise confuse me from these renowned Western philosophers' writings, including Immanuel Kant, Spinoza, Descartes, etc. Because when I read from these philosophers, I always had a feeling that there's something these philosophers were not completely open to say. They were saying it, they were brave enough to say in a way that people from medieval times dare not, but still they were withholding something, they were holding something back. And later I understood that it's because of that they were scared of the Catholic authorities of their time, and they were in fear of religious persecution, something like that. So exoteric writing was a very effective way for them to express themselves, not necessarily to the whole population, but at least to the few intellectuals. And that's enough for them, actually. And And now let's going back to the topic of why I see socialism with Chinese characteristics is also a way of exoteric writing. Because if we look at the background of when People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, there was major struggle between the two powers in the world, between Soviet Union and America. And there's no way that you can say, well, I don't want to side with any, I want to choose my own independence. It's impossible. It's completely impossible. China must choose a side at the time. There's no other choice. And of course, China choose the side of Soviet Union, the socialist side, so the communist side, whatever. But have you guys ever thought of why China was allied to Soviet Union rather than part of it? China actually fell into serious conflict with Soviet Russia in the 1950s and also in the late 1960s. Soviet Russia almost threatened to nuke China in the late 1960s, in the early 70s. And what happened was actually Chairman Mao said, well, if you're gonna nuke us, we're going to throw our nuclear bomb to America, to American military base in Japan, and I will take the whole Chinese population, walk to Russia and become Russia, and you can just nuke China, and we will abandon the land, no problem. This actually scared America, and then America talked to Russia. Well, okay, don't nuke China. If you nuke China, we'll nuke you. This is something too dramatic. But why China fell into serious conflict with the Soviet Union and was not part of it in the first place? Precisely because of that, China didn't follow rigidly the so-called Marxist-Leninism doctrines of socialism, but rather chose its own way of development, which is based on the political economic reality of China that is very different from both Soviet Union and the West. It made many achievements based on China's historical experience, but it also made many mistakes like the Great League, 3 years of famine, and the Cultural Revolution. That's the biggest disasters ever in Chinese history, by the way. I mean the Cultural Revolution. But these mistakes happened precisely because China was unable to completely overcome the residues of the disadvantages of the communist system, the so-called totalitarian way of development. And now I want to say something that is probably unpleasant to be heard by both the left wing and right wing from the West, which is that China grows from zero to the almost number one economy in the world, not because of its ideological approach from either socialism or capitalism, but rather from its own political exercise, which is based on the political culture in Chinese history. And meanwhile, it has to constantly overcome the disadvantages of both communism and capitalism created. But China has to exercise its art of politics under the framework of so-called socialism, in a way that is comparable to how America exercised its empiricism under the name of liberal democracy. And by the way, liberal democracy is nothing but oligarchy feudalism in its core. And China has to bring in the framework of socialism and capitalism because its traditional political thinking firmly rejects the idea of industrialization. And it's precisely socialism and capitalism that can industrialize China. If you look at China in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, which is the Ming Dynasty, you would know that China was actually most advanced in science and technologies at the time in the whole world. They invented very huge ships, very advanced textile machines that are used to make silk and clothes, etc. And they also invented very advanced cannons, which were later brought in by the Catholic Church to defeat Muslims in Granada and Spain, actually. But you may wonder why all these advanced scientific technologies didn't give birth to industrialized capitalism in China. Actually, this is a question that also confused Max Weber, the German sociologist. The answer is that both Chinese philosophy and Chinese social ethics reject the idea of systematic industrialization. It sees systematic industrialization as a way to destroy nature, as a way to destroy relations between human and nature, as well as that between human and human. This is something Karl Marx would call alienation, actually, alienation. Chinese culture rejects alienation. So if you look at China, it had very advanced textile machines at the time, but still it serves as extensions of human hands. They are tools that can be used by me, but not something that become so automated in itself, and finally we as human beings have to serve him. Well, this is something so scary in terms of Chinese ethics. And also, if you build such kind of machines, it's a challenge to the king's authority, actually. Since I just mentioned Max Weber, I find it necessary to mention a bit more about his research on the origins of capitalism. Max Weber is known for his proposition of the origin of capitalism that comes from the Protestant ethics. But in his detailed research, he shows you actually even before the enclosure. In England, the enclosure, during which time the farmers were forced out of their lands, and the lands were used for growing sheep. But even before that time, the landlords tried to make more profits by offering the farmers more income if they work more. But what happened in reality was that the farmers worked less because the traditional agricultural society was very conservative. The farmers had no idea what to do with extra money. They don't need so-called capital surplus. They don't need that. They just need the income that is enough to maintain their living in that year. Because they are not greedy people at all. This foundation, this discovery, however, coincides precisely with Michael Hudson's research outcomes. That's why I find it a very important research point. In Michael Hudson's work, and forgive their depths, he mentioned the new liberal historians who try to assume that gathering capital surplus is the nature of all human society, of all human beings. It's like in our nature, like since the beginning of human history, that we all try to gather capital surplus or something, just because we are greedy human beings, something like that. And he mentioned that these historians try to convince you in the ancient Germanic tribes, these Germanic tribes were always try to gather more settlers, more capital settlers, and more. But actually, from Michael Hudson's discoveries, this is completely a lie. Because these agricultural tribes did not need settlers, did not need capital settlers at all. They never had the idea of accumulating capital settlers. Never. This is fictitious, made by the neoliberal historians. The reality was, if there was any surplus at all for these Germanic tribes, they rather use it for buying some accessories or trade for some other useful stuff for them, but not to leave them as capital settlers for next year stuff. No. Fictitious thinking or fictitious theorizing is not something unusual to be seen in the modern Western philosophy. If we look at the Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, they all like to assume that human society starts with something they call natural state, in which human beings fight each other constantly, like human to humans, like wolf to wolf, like we're like animals fighting each other until a certain moment that we decided to make some social contracts. This is not the reality. It doesn't fit any historical reality of any ancient human civilization. I'm not suggesting that it's impossible for some barbarian tribes that their society really works in this way, like natural state. But to assume that natural state is something that fits human society in general, that is the start point of human society in general, is simply ridiculous. But why the modern Western thinkers like to think in a fictitious way about human society? It's because the rise of the modern West started with the rise of scientific technologies. And it makes the thinkers turn to think about human being, about human society, in the same way as they think about the physical, chemical objects of natural science. If we look at the founders of modern Western philosophy, they were all quite advanced in scientific methodologies. Descartes invented analytical geometry, and Francis Bacon invented a series of methodologies which later developed into British empiricism. But their thinking in humanity is very limited due to historical circumstances. If you look at Descartes, for his famous cogito, I think, so I am, there's actually a very strong sense of uncertainty and confusion in it, actually. And it's because of that, before him, it was 1,000 years of medieval dark ages. It was a vacuum. It was a gap that overshadows the new age that is going to come. That's why in Descartes' thinking, he falls so easily into the intellectual trap of seeking for an external God as the solid foundation of self-consciousness, because this is something that he has been so used to. If we look at the major disasters of totalitarianism in the 20th century, they all bear the feature of treating human society in a way as how a scientific experiment is conducted with physical objects. And when the scientific experiment failed, well, you see human being destroyed, like how atoms being destroyed in a failed scientific experiment. And all Western ideologies, in my opinion, are just a combination of a medieval god and a scientific experiment. But human beings are not scientific objects. Human beings are not atoms, never. The highest sign of human civilization is not scientific technologies, but the political exercise of humanity. And in China, it had at least 2,000 years of history of the political exercise of humanity. But in the West, this has never existed. Actually, in the ancient Greek, it was the only time they had chance to build one, Socrates. But he was executed, very unfortunately. And here's where the East and the West differ so much in their paths of development. The West goes into the path of oligarchy feudalism, when East, like China, goes into the path of unified civilization with centralized government. The central government of China didn't have the dictating power over the regions of the country. It only has the ethical authority, the moral authority over them. What goes hand in hand with the centralized government of China was a nationwide county region system. So the whole country was divided into around 100 counties, and every county consists of 10 to 15 regions. So above all, it was around 1,400 regions in China at the time, 2,000 years ago. So the feudal system of any kind was completely replaced by the county region system with the centralized government. Actually, the only feudal dynasty that ever existed in China was Zhou dynasty, that started from 11th century BC and ended in 8th century BC. But even feudalism in Zhou dynasty was very different from the feudalism in medieval Europe. In Zhou dynasty, these feudal landlords, all their lands were divided into big squares. And every big square consists of 9 small squares in grids. And the central grid is called the public land, which means all the farmers have to grow things together in that land, and all the harvesting goes to the landlord. But the 8 grids surrounding that central grid belongs to the farmers themselves. Every farmer owns one grid. It doesn't really mean ownership. It means the right. It means the rights of use. It means that if you grow things there, and everything you harvest by the end of the year belongs to you. It goes to becomes your private property. All these factors combined together shows you actually Karl Marx's theory on feudalism doesn't apply to China at all. Actually, Karl Marx himself has to call the Eastern Asian agriculture China the Asiatic way of production, which is very different from European feudalism. Now let's come back to the topic of the political exercise of humanity. Some people like to ask that why you don't have political or economic theorist like Karl Marx in China. The reason is very simple. The reason is that any Chinese intellectuals who had profound thinking in politics and economy can join the government and become government officials and put their thinking into practice immediately. So they don't need to write a book about their theories. They can just do it. And if there are some big changes that they believe that must be done to the central system, to the country system, they can just write a letter, write an article, and submit it to the king. The key idea of the Chinese political philosophy is that knowing and doing must be unified, must happen at the same time, and there shouldn't be any gaps in between. This is an effective way of not wasting the intellectual talents. And by the way, China had a very developed system of picking up intellectuals from the grassroots. It had a national exam system that was equal for everyone to participate. And during the exam, they tested your Confucius learnings of morality, and they also tested your practical solution for the difficult problems, for the difficult political economic problems that the country was facing at the time. And you have to write a long treatise as an answer to these questions. One reason the West invented liberal democracy in the modern time was that the political power was not open to the public. It was monopolized by the royal families. But in China, this problem never existed in history. There are still many things I need to explain in details, but I better stop for today, because otherwise it will be too much for the audiences to digest, and I better leave it for the next time. And thank you very much for watching, and sorry for the editings. It's the first time I made a self-media. It's the first time I made a video. I had difficult time focusing on the camera, and hopefully I can do it better next time. See you.